Good afternoon. This is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is the lecture titled Creating a Nation. The main point that we are trying to make in this lecture, the thesis statement, is on your screen. And it says, after the US Constitution was ratified or approved, Anti-Federalists seemed ready to give the government a chance. But before long, they raised alarms about Washington's domestic and foreign policies. Under the Constitution, the nation sort of restarted. The United States had, as we know, been operating for more than a decade under the Articles of Confederation. But now they were beginning a new form of government under the US Constitution. So they began in earnest. And beginning the new government was a moment of great triumph for George Washington, the first president personally, as well as for the country. Adoring supporters everywhere greeted him as Washington left his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, made his way to New York City, where the capital was located, where the old Congress, Confederation Congress, had used to meet, and now where the new US Congress was assembled. Washington had a sense of heaviness. Sometimes we call it gravitas or weight, seriousness, because the new government faced a lot of very difficult decisions in the first few days and weeks. And Washington realized that his actions, no matter how seemingly insignificant, would set precedents for the new nation. Every decision, no matter how trivial, seemed full of importance. For instance, his decision to take the oath of office publicly, to be sworn in publicly, which wasn't required in the Constitution, but he felt was important to do anyway. Another precedent had to do with how you would address the new president. Some people suggested very formal titles like Your Excellency or Your Highness. He recommended Mr. President. That is the form of address that we still adhere to, at least in the present, up to the present. The first order of business facing the new Congress was to draft and send to the states for ratification a new Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is a list of rights, like a bill in a restaurant has many different parts to it. This bill or list contained a number of rights that different state ratifying conventions had insisted upon as a condition for ratification. And if the Congress were to take this up as the first order of business, it would reassure anybody that had doubts about the government's powers, and it would build support for the government. The states ratified 10 of the 12 amendments sent to them by the Congress. This is a picture of Federal Hall, where the first government was located, sort of like the Capitol of the United States today. It was called Federal Hall. The Confederation Congress met here, and then later the Congress of the United States met here. That building is on Wall Street on the corner there, and it's looking north to the west side of Federal Hall up there on the right. From this vantage point today, you would be standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange. That building was torn down in 1812, and a second Federal Hall was built there, and it still stands today if you go to Lower Manhattan and look at it. This is another view of the same building from the other side, and you can see here where George Washington took the oath of office publicly on the second floor there on the balcony. This is the so-called first White House, if you will, before there was a White House. This is the president's mansion in New York City. And when George Washington was president and the capital was in New York, the president lived here and received guests and so on. The Bill of Rights. This is a copy from the National Archives of the amendment sent to the states for ratification by the Congress of the United States. It's a little hard to read that, of course, but the Bill of Rights, as we said, 12 different rights were sent to the states, and 10 of them were adopted. Those 10 together collectively are known as the Bill of Rights. Among other things, the Bill of Rights, or sometimes just called the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, guarantee, among other things, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right of trial by jury, the right to bear arms, the right to due process of law, unreasonable searches and seizures, and compulsion to testify against yourself were forbidden, and so on. And of course, each of these has tremendous significance and long histories of laws and court decisions based on these rights. As the administration's policy started to take shape, the unanimous support that had greeted the Washington administration soon started to disappear. And very soon, an opposition group or an opposition coalition, sometimes called the Jeffersonians, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, sort of rallied against the policies of Washington. And those who supported Washington were sometimes called the Federalists, although in one sense, everyone was a Federalist. What caused people to divide politically or economically over some of these questions, or philosophically, were some of the proposals put forth by the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was a very strong figure. He's now, of course, undergoing what some people call a rehabilitation, a historical rehabilitation of his image. There's a Broadway play named after him, and it's important to know what he believed and to understand what he thought. Hamilton was a nationalist, and that is, he really believed in the supremacy of the national government. And he believed that the government should promote economic enterprise, especially manufacturing and commerce. And he believed that to do that, a close alliance between the government and business or capitalists would be necessary, particularly if the United States were to achieve economic greatness. Hamilton was a political conservative. He had supported the revolution, but he had serious misgivings about the purposes and wisdom of ordinary people. He had urged the Constitutional Convention to concentrate power in the society's elites, but he did believe that the Constitution was an improvement over the Articles of Confederation, so he supported it. But now that he was in the government as Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton wanted to stabilize the government's finances, establish credit, build its power, and then tie wealthy individuals to the government to promote investment, commercial expansion overseas, and economic development at home. In his first report on the public credit in 1790, Secretary of Treasury Hamilton recommended that the war debts of the states be paid off by the national government, and then paying it at full face value, because some currency had lost its value. So he wanted to pay back all the state debts at full face value. His goal was to build confidence in the national government and then tie it closely to business and commercial interests. And some people, that was a device. So that policy, by the way, is called assumption, where the federal government assumes state debt. Some people were against this proposal. Southerners in particular felt that Northerners who had purchased many of the securities, the federal government securities or national government securities, would benefit. Also, many Southern states had already paid their debts, so they felt it was not fair for Northern states to have their debts paid when they had already paid theirs. So a compromise was reached, and in order to approve the bill. And a compromise means, of course, that you have to give something to get something. And so it wasn't a perfect bill, but the one central element of the compromise was that the decision was made to relocate the federal capital from New York, move it temporarily to Philadelphia, and then move it to the south where a new federal district would be created called the District of Columbia. So the capital was relocated to the south, land was taken from Virginia and Maryland, and a federal district that was created called the District of Columbia. And it's not a state, it's a federal area, a federal district. And so, and Southerners believed that with the national government headquartered in the South, they would better be able to control its development. Excuse me. Here's a painting, a famous painting by John Trumbull of Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. Very, very important figure in our country's history. This is a view of the new United States Capitol building before it was completed. You can see that the area here in the District of Columbia is still quite primitive and undeveloped. That's the original building still stands with refurbishments and modifications, of course, but this is the current Capitol. Now, the next point has to do with creating a national bank. Now that seems like a very straightforward question, but it turned out to be a very controversial law. The Hamilton proposed that a national bank be created in order to handle the nation's financial affairs. Also, it would be able to gather or pool private investment capital for economic development. A lot of Southerners opposed the bill because they believed that the bank would help Northern manufacturers more than Southern farmers. So before he signed the bill, President Washington asked his cabinet secretaries what their opinions were. And he was especially interested in the opinions of Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, and of course, Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of Treasury. And Alexander Hamilton argued that since Congress had the power to collect taxes and to regulate trade, it had what he called implied power to charter a bank and to enable it to carry out those duties. So in other words, Hamilton understood that the Constitution didn't really directly or expressly or explicitly say there could be a bank, but he said that the Constitution implied or said indirectly that a bank could be created. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was Secretary of State, had a much more limited view of government. Jefferson said that the Constitution only allowed the government those powers specifically or expressly given to it. So since the Constitution said nothing about creating a national bank, then an amendment to the Constitution would need to be sent to the states for ratification, and then if it passed, a bank could be created. Now, one way to illustrate this is a simple way to illustrate this, I suppose, would be, let's suppose that you're a parent and you have a son or a daughter that has just got a driver's license. Then they ask you for permission to use the car on Friday night. And you say, well, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? And your son or daughter says to you, well, I want to hang out. Your daughter says, well, I want to hang out with Susie. Okay, well, that's fine. You can have the car, but you have to be home by 11 p.m. And if you're going to be late, you need to call us so we don't worry about you, because we're not going to bed until you're safely home. So Friday night comes, your daughter takes the car out. You're tired, you want to go to bed, but you're waiting for her, and it's almost 11. And then it's a couple of minutes before 11, the phone rings. It's your daughter. She says, hi, Mom, hi, Dad. Don't worry, everything's fine. I promised you I would call you if I'm going to be late. I just want to let you know that I'm going to be late. And you say, okay, well, we're kind of tired. We want to go to bed. What time will you be home? And then your daughter says to you, well, I'm not sure. I'm still in San Diego. Of course, you live in Los Angeles. So you, as a committed Jeffersonian parent, say to your daughter, I never told you, I never gave you explicit express permission that you could go to San Diego. Your daughter, however, a committed Hamiltonian who believes in implied powers, says, well, you never said I couldn't. So which view of power gives your daughter more freedom? Well, obviously, the Hamiltonian view does. In other words, Thomas Jefferson, at least at this time in his career, said the government can only do what the Constitution says it may do. Hamilton was saying, in a manner of speaking, the government can do whatever it wants to do unless the Constitution says it may not. So there you see the difference. And people at this point began to be very concerned about Alexander Hamilton because they believed that he wanted to build a very powerful government that would not be able to be curbed or limited in any way. Also, Hamilton proposed a series of new taxes. One of those taxes was on whiskey. And he wanted to raise taxes in order to fund the development of the country's infrastructure, to build bridges, to build canals and things like that. Those proposals were very unpopular and did not pass. And it wasn't long before Hamilton's opponents started to attack his programs. They accused him of using his office for his own benefit. And he retaliated and attacked Thomas Jefferson, and Washington, alarmed by this infighting, pleaded for restraint, but clearly political divisions were getting bigger and bigger. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion, it's a very important event because it shows us, it illustrates, it's a historical lesson in the suspicion, the popular suspicion of the government's power to tax. This event shows us how ordinary people greatly feared the government's taxation power. Now, there was a lot of opposition to the whiskey tax in Western Pennsylvania. Now, Western Pennsylvania, there was a lot of commercial agriculture. Now, there was no slavery there, really, because the work could be done by seasonal workers. But farmers in Western Pennsylvania grew large amounts of grain, like wheat and rye and oats, things like that. And then they took their surplus grain and distilled it into whiskey, and then transported it across the mountains to Philadelphia, where it was sent out And so Hamilton's proposal to put a tax on whiskey would make that enterprise or that industry less profitable. And it was already threatened by whiskey being made elsewhere. So they pleaded with Hamilton and the Federalists to do away with the tax. And then in 1794, there were mass meetings and protests in Western Pennsylvania to denounce the tax and to threaten anybody that would come and try to collect the taxes. Alarmed by that, George Washington sent troops, nearly 15,000 of them, to suppress the rebellion. And as the Federal Army approached, the whiskey rebels dispersed. The whiskey rebellion never threatened the safety of the government, as Shays' Rebellion did. But a lot of people wondered about the willingness of the government to use its military power against ordinary citizens just to collect a tax. This is a picture of a painting of George Washington reviewing the troops who will march into Western Pennsylvania to suppress the whiskey rebels. This is a whiskey insurrection in Western Pennsylvania. You can see here they've taken a tax collector and they have tarred and feathered him, and then they are parading him through the streets to embarrass him. Point two, the Republic in a threatening world. Republic in a threatening world. The first point has to do with Washington's domestic policies. This point has to do with Washington's foreign policies. Now, there were sharp divisions in the country over Washington's foreign policies. And they had, a president can't really control events that take place. But the one event that did occur, which had a large impact on the country and on Washington's administration, was the French Revolution. Now, excuse me, the French Revolution is a complicated event, and you don't need to know all the details about it. I'll show you some overheads and talk about it briefly, but the French Revolution started in 1789 as a moderate attempt to reform a very corrupt autocratic monarchy. The French kings were very corrupt. But when the revolution happened, it very soon took a radical turn, even a bloody turn. And pretty soon, strict demands for social justice outweighed the more moderate efforts to bring about constitutional reform. And that war, as the revolution became more radical, it threatened Europe, and the counter-revolutionary forces of England, led by England, opposed the French revolutionary government. So there's the French revolutionary government against the more conservative alliance of countries in Europe, led by England, and a war breaks out in in Europe. And so there's a large war taking place there. And that revolution and the war divided Americans. And now it polarized public opinion. It split public opinion, as many wars, of course, often do. The official policy of the United States government was to stay neutral, to not take sides. Excuse me. Because American merchants were trying to rebuild their trade, and they sent a lot of non-military supplies and products to both France and England. So the US trade would be interrupted by a war. Not only that, but England began to board American ships on the high seas and then to inspect them to see if there were any weapons headed for France. And then they would take American sailors and then impress them or forcibly conscript them into the English or the Royal Navy. So Washington was in a quandary because he didn't agree with many elements of what was going on in France, but we were obligated to support France because of a treaty between our country and France dating back to 1778. So in the beginning, a lot of Americans identify with the French Revolution because in our own revolution, France had helped us, and many Americans, most notably Thomas Jefferson, saw in the French Revolution an extension of our own revolution. In other words, many people believe that the new world was teaching wisdom to the old world, and that the overthrow of monarchy was a good thing. But Washington and Hamilton believed that England was the defender of European civilization, and they believed that it would be important to ally with, or at least they were sympathetic to England, and they were becoming increasingly hostile to France. Thomas Jefferson, however, had a very remarkable ability to find hope, even in circumstances that others would see as beyond hope. He really was a very important insight that he supplied like that at different times. This is a rendering of the Bastille in Paris before 1789, before the Revolution. The Bastille was a prison used to jail opponents of the French kings. If you opposed the king, they would put you here. Now, there weren't a lot of people in the jail at the moment, but they had historically been used for that. And the Bastille was destroyed, of course, after the French Revolution, and French people today still celebrate July 14th as Bastille Day. The destruction of the Bastille sort of represents the end of the old regime in France. This is a painting titled Storming the Bastille. The French Revolution begins. You can see the destruction and the fires and the damage being done by French revolutionaries against the royalist or the king's properties. The French revolutionaries also began to carry out a series of killings against the kings and against anybody that was closely connected to the king. And they used the guillotine to do that. You can see in this painting, the French revolutionaries are killing Louis XVI, the king of France. And so this became very bloody and very retributive. And many Americans said this was not what we had done in our revolution. So there was debate about that, for sure. Now, the French government tried to repair damaged relations with the United States. And it did that in April 1793 by sending this man, Citizen Genet, to the United States. He was the French foreign minister, Edmond Genet. I think in April 1793, he arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. And he was instructed by his government to build public support for France inside the United States, to fan Francophilia or love of France, to blow up love of France, and then to negotiate a commercial treaty with the United States. But Genet soon did some things that diplomats are not supposed to do. He threatened US neutrality and our sovereignty by interfering in our affairs, by commissioning American privateers or ship owners for hire to go and attack Spanish Florida, because England and Spain were allies against France. And so he's trying to conduct a military policy inside the United States. Of course, this is very, very upsetting to President Washington. And then he spoke to Congress, and he urged Congress to reject Washington's neutrality proclamation. And so Washington sat him down and then urged that he be recalled or kicked out of the country. Interestingly, he was threatened with arrest in France, and so he spent the rest of his days in the United States, sort of in a twilight zone or a gray zone. And but what he did do, what Genet did, was he caused Americans to debate the worth or the validity of the French Revolution. Or to put it another way, there were groups of Americans who formed these democratic Republican societies or democratic Republican clubs up and down the country, from the south to the north, from the coast inland. And these groups met together and they talked about, what does it mean to be a Republican? What does it mean to live in a republic? Because Genet said, if Americans are truly Republicans, and if they're not monarchists, if they don't believe in having a king, but they believe the people are sovereign, then they should support what's going on in France. So this whole French Revolution caused Americans to sort of look at themselves in a mirror and ask themselves, well, are we truly a Republican country? Or are we more allied with kings, because even now we're supporting England over France? And so there was a lot of discussion. And inside these democratic Republican societies, and don't be confused by the term democratic Republican, it just means, Republican means of the people, and Democrat means sort of rule by the people. So these are people, the Democratic Republicans, and that term is sometimes used to describe Jefferson and his supporters. It just means that they're Republicans, but they're not aristocratic Republicans, but Democratic Republicans. They believe they were on the side of ordinary people, not on the side of the powerful and the wealthy, at least in theory. And what's important is that these individuals in these clubs debated, and they put together a critique of the Federalist foreign policy and the Federalist domestic policy. A critique is not just a criticism or a personal attack, which sometimes seems to characterize politics. These were analyses. These were analytical kinds of criticisms, or analytical sort of ways of looking and critiquing these policies. For example, in the West, the Democratic Republican clubs there objected to the fact that England still had its troops on American soil in British bases near the Great Lakes, up in the Midwestern part of the country. And they criticized Spain for shutting the mouth of the Mississippi. In the East, these societies criticized the fact that England was interfering with American ships on the high seas. And they sort of hit the nail on the head, if you will, because their criticisms caused George Washington to do something he very rarely did, which was to lash out at them. Washington was angered by the fact that these societies supported Genet, and that he was upset that they criticized government programs, and he branded them as dangerous radicals trying to create a rebellion, which wasn't true. They were merely ordinary citizens trying to discuss policy. And so Washington was very upset by this. Here's an engraving of Citizen Genet, French envoy to the United States during the French Revolution. This is the so-called Pennsylvania White House when the capital moved from New York City to Philadelphia before it moved to Washington, D.C. This is where the president lived in Philadelphia. And this is, in this house, this is where George Washington reprimanded Citizen Genet, the French foreign minister. In 1794, John Jay, who was an important Federalist and one of the founders of the country, John Jay was sent by President to France to try to, to England, to try to work out a treaty, because Washington was stung, and rightly so, by many of the criticisms of the Democratic Republican clubs. So this treaty was, John Jay went to England to discuss with the English removing troops from American bases, removing English troops from American soil in the Great Lakes area in the Northwest Territory, violation of our neutrality rights at sea, and so on. John Jay came back with a treaty that resolved almost none of those concerns. And when England said sort of take it or leave it, the United States took it. And there was a protest of anger against the treaty because it did nothing to, Americans felt like Washington was giving away the country and bowing down to England and not standing up for its own rights as a nation. And so John Jay sort of had a sullen response. Well, this is as good as we can do, and that's what we're going to do. And it passed the Senate, and it was ratified. But what happened was this was sort of by this point in 1795, political harmony had just disappeared, had evaporated. Jefferson, frustrated, resigned as Secretary of State. Then he and others began to rally together in open opposition to the Washington administration. And in September 1796, George Washington himself announced that he would not accept a third term. He was exhausted, somewhat bitter, and perhaps disillusioned about the controversy that surrounded him. And he felt as if the country were breaking apart into factions. What in fact he was doing was sort of breaking up into parties. And parties were seen as factions and special interests. But what Washington didn't fully understand, and others didn't either, was this was the future of the country, to be based on a party system, which of course we still are. This is a copy of the treaty, Jay's treaty. This was the first treaty with a foreign government ever concluded and ratified under the US Constitution. Many Americans felt the treaty was one-sided, benefiting only Great Britain and Spain, and paying too great a price for peace. It did divide the country and helped to create the beginnings of what came to be called party loyalties. Now, the political crisis deepens. Once George Washington decided that he would not run for a third term. This was the first time in the United States, in its short history, that there would be a peaceful transfer of power between the Washington administration and whatever administration would be coming in. The two main candidates were John Adams, the vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Both of these men had played very distinguished roles in the American Revolution and the establishment of the new nation. They were longtime friends, but they were very different in the way they acted, the way they thought, and probably by 1796, by this time, they certainly had very different visions for the future. Adam was a very committed Federalist. He believed in a very strong national government. He was appalled by the French Revolution. Jefferson, on the other hand, supported the Constitution, but he was very concerned about Hamilton's financial program. He was very mistrustful of Hamilton's view of implied powers, and Jefferson thought that the French Revolution was similar to ours. But in that election, Adams came in first, and in the Electoral College, and Jefferson came in second, so he became the vice president. So the winner was the president, the runner-up was vice president. Now the Constitution has been changed, and both president and vice president are in the same party. This is a painting of John Adams on the left, the vice president who went on to become president, a one-term president, versus Thomas Jefferson on the right, who was Secretary of State. The XYZ affair. John Adams became the second president of the United States. And he wanted to ease political tensions with France. So he sent a commission, a group of individuals, to Paris to try to negotiate a treaty, some kind of agreement. But in Paris, when those individuals, when the American commissioners arrived, 3 agents of the French foreign minister, whose name was Talleyrand, 3 of Talleyrand's men, told the commissioners that before negotiations could begin, that the United States would have to pay a loan, I believe in the amount of $10 million, would have to lend France $10 million, and a bribe would also have to be paid by the American government. Now, when, of course, there was no agreement. So when the Americans came back, when Congress heard, when the report was given to Congress about what happened, Americans were outraged. Now, it's a little hard for us today to understand why that would be so upsetting. Part of it is because there was a lot of division in the country about France, but also back then there was a culture of honor. And if you insulted someone's honor personally, you might have a duel or something like that. Alexander Hamilton himself died in a duel. I mean, so you would sort of have this ceremony, you would face off and take 10 steps and turn and shoot. And now it was discouraged, but it still happened occasionally, but this was an honor-based culture, something that's a little hard to understand in the same way today. So American honor was insulted. And in light of the French insult to American honor, as hard to believe as this sounds, an undeclared naval war started. And the United States began to build up its military and its navy in particular to defend against a French attack. In May of 1798, the Congress created the Navy Department. And then called for a rapid deployment of a naval force to defend our coast against French attack. Congress repealed the treaty, our country's treaty with France, dating back to 1778. It even approved the formation of a 10,000-man standing army, something that would have been unthinkable before. Although even Adams himself was alarmed about the army and delayed it. But what happened was that the Federalists became very fearful of subversion. Now, this is a painting of French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who demanded monetary concessions from the United States in order for negotiations to begin. The XYZ affair began when 3 of his agents, named X, Y, and Z, made the demands. This is a British cartoon that sort of makes fun of the United States and the XYZ affair. Here you see the United States in the figure of Columbia, a woman there, and then you see French men doing inappropriate things to her while they're taking money. Then on the hill on the right, you can see John Bull. That's the sort of symbol of England, sort of like Uncle Sam today is ours. You see him laughing at the squabble between the United States and France. But it was more than a squabble. It was a squabble that had a lot of people upset. So the United States then began to, as we said, build up the military. And the United States became very fearful that there were efforts underway to subvert or to undermine the stability of our government. Now, many of the Federalists in charge knew that there were French immigrants in the United States. Most of them were not citizens, but they were in the process of becoming citizens. They knew that French immigrants were active in the opposition, and they knew that French immigrants were very supportive of Thomas Jefferson. And so the Federalist Congress then passed a naturalization law called the Naturalization Act. That law, which was intended, it seems spiteful in a way, because it extended the residence requirement from 8 years to 14 years. That would make it harder for French immigrants to become citizens. And then it passed the Alien Act, which allowed the president to expel people, in his opinion, who were dangerous foreigners inside the country. And then Congress passed the Sedition Act. That law made opposition or criticism of the government illegal. Congress passed the Sedition Act, which made opposition to or criticism of government measures illegal and punishable by fine and or imprisonment. Now, they crossed the line. The Federalists would call this excess. As one scholar said, the Federalists, who now equated preservation of their own political power with national survival, threatened to smother political opposition. In other words, they're trying to stamp out quickly, before the law expired, any opposition or criticism of the government. In other words, it's an attack on free speech. Federalist implementation of the Alien Sedition Acts caused a lot of foreigners to leave the country. If there were many people charged with violating the Sedition Act, including a U.S. Congressman, Matthew Lyon, from the state of Vermont, as well as a number of other Jeffersonian printers and editors. The Alien Sedition Acts generated a lot of fierce opposition around the country and even inside the halls of the Congress. Here on the sort of in the middle with the giant tongs, you can see that's Congressman Matthew Lyon from Vermont engaged in a fight with this U.S. Congressman Roger Griswold from Connecticut. The congressman with the tongs in the middle, Matthew Lyon, was found guilty and sentenced to jail for violating the Sedition Act on October 10th, 1798. Interestingly, he won re-election to Congress from his jail cell. Imagine that. The other interesting fact about the Federalist excess, the Federalists going to these extremes to quell opposition, is that it reverberated at the local level. The Alien Sedition Acts, as we've said, generated a lot of protest. Two state legislatures, the legislature of Kentucky and Virginia, passed resolutions. So they weren't laws, but they were resolutions which gave what are called a sense of the legislature. They sort of tell people how the legislature of a state is thinking, what their feelings are on a subject. And these resolutions, in essence, said that when the national government violates the Bill of Rights, that states have the right to nullify or not obey federal laws. Now, those resolutions did not receive a lot of support outside those states, and neither state ever tried to obstruct enforcement of the Alien Sedition Acts. But what people not everyone knew was that the Kentucky resolutions were drafted by Jefferson, who was a sitting vice president of the United States. And the Virginia resolutions were authored by James Madison. So here you have a sitting vice president telling the states that, in his opinion, they were free to disobey a federal law that they thought was unconstitutional, that even might be unconstitutional. But of course, the constitutional remedy for a situation like this is for the state government to go to court and to get a judge to strike the law down, to rule that the law itself is unconstitutional. So the crisis remained. Now, one last point, please. John Adams was a one-term president, but he ran for re-election in 1800. And he ran again against Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson came back to try a second time. Now, we put Revolution of 1800 in quotes because sometimes historians call it a revolution. It really wasn't a revolution, but as we will see, Adams loses this election and Jefferson wins, and Jefferson takes the country in a very different, fascinating direction. That's very important, that we'll see in the next lecture. But the election of 1800 found the Federalists in disarray. That is, they had been charged with the unconstitutional exercise of power. They had smothered political dissent. They had used the army against citizens to collect taxes. And the party itself was divided between Federalists who supported John Adams and other Federalists who supported Alexander Hamilton. So because the Federalists were split, in the end, Thomas Jefferson was able to win that election. And he did not receive a majority of votes in popular votes. He didn't receive a majority of votes in the Electoral College. And in a case like that, the election is decided by the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives voted Jefferson to be the president. And he won that election, as a number of historians have pointed out, with the votes of Southern slaveholders. For many years, Jefferson was called the Negro president. And what that derogatory term meant was that he was put into the White House with the votes of Southern slaveholders. Now, the result of, and we'll see how that election played out in the next lecture. Now, the result of the election was that the Federalists lost a lot of power. They lost the White House, and they lost both chambers of the Congress. They lost the House of Representatives and the US Senate. Also, after this point, the Federalists were pretty much strong only in New England, that is in the upper north. The middle states were divided. The South were decidedly pro-Jeffersonian. So, and of course, another, as we will see, another result of the election was that increasingly both of these groups appeal to different parts of the country. The Federalists were very strong among merchants and manufacturers and commercial farmers along the coast, but the Jeffersonians absorbed into their ranks most of the old anti-Federalists, as well as farmers, urban workers, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, immigrants. And of course, the interesting thing is that when Jefferson takes the White House, he comes in as a very strong proponent of states' rights. He is a strong believer in express powers, that the national government can only do what it's expressly allowed to do in the Constitution by language in the Constitution. And the interesting thing is that he becomes a very powerful president who acted almost as if he believed in implied powers. So Jefferson seems to have jettisoned some of his beliefs once he was in the White House. We'll have to talk about that next time. But I do hope that this lecture was a benefit to you. I urge you to sort of replay parts of it if you're not clear about something, and sort of be sure to email me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.